Hello and welcome to this video where we will use an Excel formula to look up and return multiple values. And the technique used here is available in all versions of Excel. This is a follow-up video to one I released a few days ago, which also showed you how to look up and return multiple values, but that was using modern Excel, 365, Excel Online, and all the amazing formulas and extra functionality we have in those. This video looks across the board at all Excel versions, and we will attempt to solve the same scenarios as that previous video. In example number 1, we have this table called products, and in cell F3 we have a drop-down list of the 3 categories: beverages, cakes and pastries, and food. And on selection of one of those, such as food, we want to list all of the products related to that category from cell F6. With the array engine in modern Excel, that's reasonably straightforward. In older versions, we have a little bit more work to do. So we are going to use an array formula, and if we're doing this in older versions, we need to press Ctrl-Shift-Enter when finished, and we also need to select the range we want to return them to. We don't have the spill effect of modern Excel. The first thing we want to do is return the row numbers of the products that we want to return. Once we've done that, we can use an index function to return the product values. So, because we're using an older version of Excel example here, we need to begin by selecting the cells we want to return the array values to. So as I'm selecting it here, I'm looking up in the name box because I want to ensure I select 20 rows. I'm doing that because I know there are 20 rows in my table at 20 products. So I'm making sure I select a sufficient range for what may be returned. I can now come into the formula bar and write the formula. And we're going to begin with a typical if function because I need to make sure it only returns the products for the categories selected in cell F3. So I'm going to begin by selecting the product category column in the table and testing if it is the same as the category entered in cell F3. It's a very typical logical test of an if function there. If I put in a comma, the value, if true, will be to return the row that the product is in. For this, I'm going to use the row function and simply provide it with the column of products. It doesn't really matter what column I provide that because I'm just trying to find the row number, but it makes sense to use the products column. I'm then going to subtract 1 from that. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm returning the row number of the sheet. The row function returns the row number of the sheet. So the first product of the table is in row 2, but when we speak about the table, that is row 1. That's the first row of the table, but the second row of the sheet. So I'm subtracting 1 from that row function so that I get the correct table row. Another comma, and the value if false will be an empty string, just 2 double quotes there. We'll close this off and then do Control, Shift and Enter to run an old array formula. And that returns to that selected area the row numbers of the food products. And when it is not a food product, we have that empty string, that value if false we provided to if. So that's great. We've got the row numbers we need, but I don't want all these empty strings, these blank spaces. So around the if function, if I return back to the formula bar, I'm going to use the small function, a function that returns the kth smallest value, such as the second smallest or the fourth smallest. Now for the small function, the array is going to be the if function. That is returning those row numbers. That is returning that array. And then on the end of that, if I put in a comma, we need to specify that kth value. Now I need to return all of the values. I don't want to type something like 5 and return the fifth smallest. I want to return like all of the smallest ones in order. And I may not know how many products there are in that category. You know, food, beverages, cakes and pastries may have a different number of products. So what we'll do is we'll actually repeat that row function takeaway1 that we did a moment ago. I'm just going to copy and paste it in here just to generate a sequence of row numbers. That will simply just generate rows 1 to 20. That's all that does. So I'm asking it to return the first smallest, second smallest, third smallest, and get that series or that array of numbers. Close bracket on that and Control-Shift-Enter, and this is where we're at now. We have each row number for that product at the top, and then we've got these horrible errors underneath. Continuing with this, the next step is to bring in the index function. We want the product name from that row number. So, back to the formula bar, it's important that array is still selected when you do this. If you've clicked away, select the entire array again from row 6 to row 25. But I still have it selected, so formula bar index, one of my favourite functions in Excel. That will prompt for the array that we're returning from. Now that's simply going to be products product. I want to return the product name. In goes the comma. And then what is the row number? And that is the formula we just had. Now something's happened here and I've lost my small function. So let me type small back in. Not sure what I did there, but that is what we had a moment ago. We do not need to specify that column number, that optional argument on the end of index there, because I'm only providing it with one column in the array, the products column. So we can just come to the end, close off that bracket, Control-Shift-Enter, and now we have this. We can see this is almost there. I have the food products listed, those multiple values from the lookup of food. The final step, which you may be guessing looking at this, is to add an IFERROR function. Now I believe IFERROR came out in Excel 2010, so there are ways of handling this in versions prior to that. So this technique will work in all versions if we take maybe an older approach, such as IFERROR and the if function. But I'm going to make the assumption that 2010 is far enough back to consider this all versions. So I'm going to use IFERROR. So in the formula, the final touch here is IFERROR. That is the value we're checking, that array of product names, and on the end, comma, what do you want to do instead? Empty string, close bracket. Don't forget it's Control-Shift-Enter in older versions. If you are following along in a modern version, you can just press enter because we have that spill effect. But Control-Shift-Enter here, and this is what we have. Using array formulas in older versions can be a little bit clunky. You know, having to select those 20 rows is a big limiting factor at times. But it's great that using some classic functions such as if and index and small, that we can look up multiple values in Excel. Let's give this a try. If I come to cell F3 and change that to maybe cakes and pastries, there they are. Change it to beverages, there they are. Absolutely fantastic. So that is a way of returning the multiple values in a list across all versions. Let's look at another example. The formula to return multiple values in separate rows was quite tricky, but very, very cool. But to combine the returned values into one cell, the formula can be a little bit simpler. However, the approach I'm going to take here does rely on an Excel version of 2019 at least, because we are going to use the text join version. Now we're focusing on formula approaches here, so although we are limited in this approach by version using a worksheet formula, there's always the fallback option of Power Query or creating a user-defined function in VBA. So this is possible in all versions, but this formula approach would require 2019. It's a very neat little formula though, and we don't need the filter function as demoed in the previous video. In cell G3, I want to return all of those returned values into that one cell, separated by a comma and a space, and then the same for the other two categories. Now, as mentioned, I'm going to use a brilliant function called text join. The concatenate function will not do this. There is a way we can do it with concat, the one that can handle arrays, which I believe also came out in 2019, but it does struggle. Text join is better here in the approach I want to take because of the ability to ignore spaces. The first argument is the delimiter, that is the comma space. Putting in the comma will then prompt whether we want to ignore empty cells or not. Now I'm going to say true. In the previous example, you may remember that we had many spaces, and then we used a small function to bring the numbers to the top of the array and IFERROR to hide errors, and we kind of dealt with them in our own way. Here we have an option just to ignore them. So that can be very, very useful and simplifies this formula compared to the previous example. Another comma prompts us for the text to use. We now want that array which the if function performed in that previous example. It's the same if function, so I'm moving along here, that the logical test will be the category is equal to the cell containing the category, comma, let's return the products, comma, if not, let's have that empty string, which is why we need to ignore those spaces, and then two closed brackets, one for if, one for text join, and Control Shift Enter to work in non-array versions of Excel. We can then copy that down, and very, very neat there, we have combined all of the products into one cell, but because of the use of text join, we are somewhat limited by version. It would have to be at least 2019 minimum. That is for a formula approach. Power Query is your best option for a non-formulaic approach. In this last example, once again, we want to return multiple values, but this time we know how many values there are because we have three options of locations here, option 1, 2, 3, and they have that priority. Number 1 is their first option, 2 is their second option, 3 is their third, and we want them in separate cells. So for this example, we're going to take a very different approach. In the previous video with modern Excel, we used a sort by function with filter to order them by that option column, which is really cool. I love that function. But here, to work with all versions, we're going to use the fantastic index match, a brilliant combination, and we're going to use it in an array to work with the two conditions. Because these lookups have two conditions. It has to be the name entered in column E, and it also has to be the option mentioned in row 1, cells F1, G1 and H1. So starting from cell F2 here, it's equals index, and what do we want to return? What do we need index to return? Well, that is the location. So I'm going to select the location column from the table and put in my comma. And now the row num argument is the big one. This is where we need the match function to find the relevant row, and it needs to include both conditions, the name and the option. So if I bring in match, and here are our two conditions which we're going to concatenate in that lookup value. So it needs to be the name in cell E2. Now I'm going to put a $sign just before the E of that function, because we need to lock that column for when I copy it into column G and H for option 2 and option 3. I'll then put in the ampersand to concatenate onto that the next condition, which is the number of the option. Now in cells F1, G1 and H1, the number is not alone, the word option is in there as well. However, the number is the last character, so I'm going to use the write function to extract from that cell that last character. And because we know we're going to copy this formula to the other names and the other options, once again we have to think about our reference type, and I'm going to put that dollar before number 1 to fix in row 1 so it doesn't change when we copy this formula down. Comma 1 for the last character of the write function and close that off. We could have omitted that argument. If omitted, it returns the last character. So that was redundant, but I kind of like it there for readability. Okay, a comma brings us on to the lookup array, and we need to concatenate this in the same way we did the lookup value to work with those two conditions. So the lookup array is the name first. If I select the name column of the table, ampersand to concatenate, and then the option column of the table, another comma to then prompt for the match type, which is 0, and then 2 close brackets, 1 for match, 1 for index. So that is it. Now Control-Shift-Enter for this to work in all versions of Excel, and it returns Harlow for Adam option 1. Now if I want to copy that across to options 2 and 3, I could come and drag this little fill handle, but it's all gone wrong. And this is because we're referencing the columns of a table here. And if I look at option 2, you can see that the column references have changed. Table column references are relative. Now there's a few different ways around this, and indeed I have a video going in depth on how to do this. You can check that out in the video description or through the card in the top right. For now, the approach I want to take is to delete these two, and from G2 here, I'm going to do Control R, which is the keyboard shortcut to fill right. And if we use the shortcut approach, it does not change those table column references. I'll then do the same again for H there, select them all, copy that down, and we have our grid completed. All 3 options for all names, multiple values returned, but in quite a different approach to the previous 2 examples. So when you're trying to look up multiple values, the approach you take not only depends on your version of Excel, but it also depends on your specific example. In this one, we knew the number of returned values was going to be 3. In the previous ones, we didn't really know how many products there were, and that made it a little more difficult, but there was a way. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video useful. Please give it a like if you did, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you are notified about the latest Excel videos. Bye for now.